Je vais faire mon exposé en anglais. And let's see. And not only will I speak in English, but I will also focus on Anglophone systems. In fact, all of the ones from the 1960s up that I discuss will be English language. But there's one in the 50s I want to mention that is originally a German system. And I'll also take a mainly formalist perspective on narrative. So that all of these systems are narrative, I hope, is native to your hearts, since narrative was discovered here by Gerard Genet and others. So I'm going to take this perspective as I try to explain how these different computer generation systems engage with narrative in different ways. And this talk draws on my work on Output, an anthology of computer-generated text, 1953 through 2023. I'm editing my colleague Lillian van Bertram, and it's going to be published in August by MIT Press and the nonprofit poetry press Counterpath. It's actually going to comprehend 7 decades of computer-generated text in an anthology format. So it's not a history monograph. It's an anthology of text you can read that are all computer-generated. It's focused on English, although we have included some work that was already translated. We did not commission any translations for this. And it's in many different genres. So it's not all narrative. It's not all poetry. It's not even all literature. The other project that connects to what I'm speaking about today is my work heading the Computational Narrative Systems Research Node. So I'm one of the principal investigators at the Center for Digital Narrative at the University of Bergen in Norway. And there, we're studying all sorts of types of narrative in its engagement with the digital, from social media to electronic literature to video games with narrative aspects, to emerging forms of narrative and narrative engaged with advanced interfaces. So I'm working specifically on the computational narrative systems research with, right now, some undergraduate researchers at MIT will have a PhD and postdoc at Bergen. And I'll explain a bit about what we're doing, but the types of systems, many of these systems are indeed computational narrative systems, and they're exactly the sorts of things that we'll be studying using different methods and from different perspectives. So let's go to 2019. If you remember, as I like to say, the end of the 20th century, even though we didn't know it at the time because of the events that transpired in 2020. Everyone was startled as if by an Icelandic volcano, or perhaps even more so, when we saw the output of GPT-2. And people thought this was the beginning of computer-generated narrative. After seeing this prompt that someone had typed into a system, look at what a computer could produce as a completion of this story. There were a spate of news stories declaring that OpenAI had said GPT-2 was too dangerous to release. It was going to generate fake news. It would have the potential to unsettle societies, and people would not be able to discern what it actually produced as being true or false. I like the one in the lower right. It says OpenAI just released the AI it said was too dangerous to share. The startup may have overstated the threat. So it did eventually, of course, the company did eventually release GPT-2. And it invites us, if we take a historical perspective, which we certainly are today, to look back at this text from 2019, which is remarkable in many ways, but not in the ways people thought it was. If we examine what actually was done. So first of all, we see that it says model completion, machine written, 10 tries. So after 10 attempts, right, the researchers cherry-picked this output. They selected the best of the ones that had been produced. And this is what we've seen. So it requires human oversight and editing. And this highly selected and edited, not edited, but highly selected output, let's look at the very beginning of it, the first paragraph, the lead paragraph, if this were a news story, right? It notices, if we notice here, it says, these four-horned silver-white unicorns were previously unknown to science. Now, as I understand it, a unicorn is a creature with one horn. And so if they're four-horned, we have immediately presented to us a contradiction if we're trying to read this as news. And if we continue on, we see there are some other contradictions in the article. For instance, that Perez says the creatures could be seen from the air without having to move too much to see them, as if they were coming at them in helicopters or something. We're not exactly sure, but they were in the air. But then they were so close, they could touch their horns. So I guess they must have had good helicopter pilots to get that close. So there's obviously a lot of interesting things going on with AI in the sense of generative AI, in the sense of large language models. But looking closely at what happened in 2019 encourages us to take a historical view, because before there was fake news, we had real news being generated by computers. Many, many examples of journalism of different sorts being produced effectively through computer generation. And I'll go back to the 1970s and 80s to give some examples of research projects that resulted in effective news generation. In 1974, Anthony Davey had this Proteus system. And it was a system that reported on what in the UK is called noughts and crosses. In the United States, we call it tic-tac-toe. And so it had quantitative data from this game, just as you could give, for instance, the record of a chess game to a system, and it would be able to tell you, to narrate what had happened. So this is actually a nonfiction narrative generator based on a quantitative record of a game. It says the game began with your taking a corner and I took the middle of an adjacent edge. And so it proceeds in this way to describe the entire tic-tac-toe game, which may not be a very exciting endeavor because we know that tic-tac-toe is a solved game, unlike chess. But it demonstrates the ability back in 1974, long before deep learning and before OpenAI, to come up with a project that is able to narrate based on facts. The system Mumble in 1980 is probably not, according to most text to generate text, is logical proofs. And so this is a proof of the of Russell's paradox. And it begins with an abstract representation of this logical proof. In fact, it's the same representation that another researcher used earlier. And McDonald, in his system, was improving on an existing ability to do text generation. And so the system would generate things like this, assume that there's some barber who shaves everyone who doesn't shave himself and no one else. Now, although this example, because it's propositional content, is probably not narrative, Mumble was actually able to generate text over a variety of domains. You only needed to change the dictionary in order to have it narrate in different ways. And it was capable of generating a very, very summarized two-sentence version of Macbeth. So it could serve as a narrative generator also. Now, another system that generated, again, not narrative, but description in this case, was Cathy McOwen's text from 1985. And this is fascinating for a variety of reasons. It takes database entities, and instead of providing the cryptic sort of description that you would have in a native database language, it renders them into natural language, English in this case. And of course, it also bears the traces of the defense industry's connections with research in computing, because this was funded by the Office of Naval Research, and they wanted to have their database, as I put it, textualized rather than visualized, rather than sonified. And so this is work that, again, takes a database representation and produces, to begin with, the cruiser and the ocean escort are surface ships. And you can see there's a lot of details about the properties of a cruiser, the properties of an ocean escort. And then at the end, however, it's able to make a comparison between these two and describe the ocean escort, therefore, has a smaller length and a smaller displacement than the cruiser. And there's more details that this goes into, explaining that the hull number is different in these two cases, for instance. So this is a system that would be able to explain in natural language things that would be very difficult for an ordinary user or reader to excavate from the database otherwise. And although it's descriptive, description, of course, plays a role in narrative. So this research is relevant to narrative generation. And the final system that I want to talk about in terms of, well, I'll speak about a system that specifically is able to generate rhetoric after this, but I want to speak about a system to generate weather reports. And this is RARIAS, developed in 1986. And you see that it generates, again, from underlying quantitative data, text like this: winds light, becoming southeasterly, 15 early Tuesday morning, then backing and strengthening to easterly, 30 Tuesday afternoon, then strengthening to northeasterly gales, 35 Tuesday evening, mostly cloudy with snow. And this is consistent with the genre of weather reporting that was done, more or less like the human maritime weather reports would read. And this system was further developed to do bilingual generation. It's a Canadian system, as you can see from Environment Canada, is where the data is coming, that was developed to generate in English and in French. So in terms of nonfiction narrative generation, I want to land on this piece from 1987. It's the system Pauline by Edward Hovey, done at Yale University, as might not surprise you from the content of this generated text. And this is one of the types of things that it could generate, again, from an abstract representation. Yale University punished a number of students for building a shantytown on Beinecke Plaza by arresting 76 students and tearing it down one morning in early April. The students wanted Yale to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. Finally, the university caved in and allowed the students to rebuild it. Now, it turns out, interesting as that might be, Pauline was capable of producing many other narratives that are based on the same underlying data from different perspectives. So, for instance, this one is more detailed and elaborate, and perhaps in a little bit more journalistic of a tone. It mentions the specific time and the specific date and the number of students arrested. Here is another somewhat journalistic, but slightly differently slanted version of the story that Pauline generated. And yet another. In this case, this one is taking Yale's side a bit more, not complaining about the fact that the university steamrolled over the structures that the students set up. It says the university intended to be reasonable. The university gave it permission to exist until the meeting of the Yale Corporation. But even after that, the students refused to move. And so all of these different perspectives could be expressed based on the same underlying data. And here's a more vernacular one that's from someone in favor of the actions of the students. And here's a more vernacular one from someone opposed to what the students are doing. It pisses me off that a few shiftless students were out to make trouble on Beneke Plaza one day. They built a shantytown, Winnie Mandela City, because they wanted Yale University to pull their money out of companies with business in South Africa. I'm happy that officials removed the shantytown one morning. Finally, Yale gave in and let the shitheads put it up again. And Yale said that a commission would go to South Africa to check out the system of apartheid. So this was already possible in 1987. Now, one didn't just type in a brief prompt and have this generated. You needed to define an abstract representation of the events that had transpired, which took some time and effort. So this type of symbolic approach was a different one, but a powerful one, as you can see. So we had real news and real rhetoric that was already being generated in the 70s and 80s. And I want to lead us into more of the history of narrative generation in storytelling research, in individual poetry generation, and I'll hope to conclude with a reading from a recent computer-generated novel. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a prelude, since I said I'd begin with the 1960s, and tell you what was happening in the 1950s. Not exactly narrative, but related to it, I think. And then we'll go through a narrative generator that appears in 1963 in Mexico City, a system that's interactive in 1966 in Massachusetts in the United States, a 1967 poem that's computer generated and developed in New York, and then a 1969 story generation system from Manchester. But our story begins in Manchester in 1953 when Christopher Strachey developed a system to computer generate love letters of this sort. And this is one of the examples that he published. Darling sweetheart, you are my avid fellow feeling. My affection curiously clings to your passionate wish. My liking yearns for your heart. You are my wistful sympathy, my tender liking. Yours beautifully, Manchester University Computer. So what is this? We could say that it's a computer threatening human labor, potentially taking over people's jobs. That might not be your first response to this type of system, but remember that this is not long after World War II, and in all sorts of wars, there have been people who are more literate and less literate. There's been people in villages who are more literate and less literate, and sometimes they pay those who are less literate, pay those who can write to communicate with their sweethearts back at home, right? So this type of labor that the computer is doing might in fact be human labor under certain circumstances. Whether or not that's the case, it's certainly making fun of semantically empty writing, phatic communication, perhaps making fun of heterosexual rituals, given Christopher Strachey's orientation himself. It's showing that letters are based on schema that are easily identifiable. They begin with a salutation. They have a closing. They have a signature. And I note that there is a literary connection, even a connection to the novel, because we have epistolary novels in English, Pamela, Frankenstein, Dracula, that are based on fictional letters. So another system that is very intriguing to me, related to the novel, but I would say not narrative, is Theo Lute's random sentences. And this is in English translation. Not every look is near, no village is late. A castle is free and every farmer is far. Every stranger is far. A day is late. Now, this produces logical propositions rather than narrative. And interestingly enough, a proposition and its contradiction are equally likely to be generated, right? So it's producing, well, Wittgenstein said it was all nonsense. It was either a tautology or a contradiction, but a special kind of nonsense is what it's generating. The vocabulary of this generator is drawn from Kafka's The Castle. And so I would say this is a system that's both semantically and lexically Kafkaesque. The way it generates its lines is bizarre. It follows a logic, but it's not the logic we typically think of and understand. And then the vocabulary it draws from connects us to Kafka's work. And so it is a literary and novelistic engagement, even though it doesn't actually represent a sequence of events. It's not a narrative in that sense. Now, finally, when we get to 1963, and when we go to Mexico City, we find that a linguist, Joseph Grimes, has developed a narrative generator. There's one one-page article about this in a popular magazine that, or a magazine to promote IBM that IBM published. And there's only one example of a story that was generated that survives from the system. And here it is. A lion has been in trouble for a long time. A dog steals something that belongs to the lion. The hero, lion, kills the villain dog without a fight. The hero, lion, thus is able to get his possession back. Now, Grimes based his work explicitly on ideas from Vladimir Propp. And interestingly, he used the story generator and the text that it produced to help understand indigenous languages in Mexico better. So he spoke with people who are speakers of indigenous languages to see, for instance, if he used a pronoun in one case, would they be able to understand whether this referred to the hero or the villain? How is it that the different qualities of the narrative might interact with comprehension in different languages? Mexico has hundreds of indigenous languages. So it's interesting that the first generator, although it's made by, it's programmed by a linguist who is from the United States, he's of European descent, but the context in which it emerges is in Mexico City in conversation with indigenous people. And then in 1966, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where all great things are invented, Joseph Weizenbaum developed a general system called ELIZA and a specific script called Doctor, which is nowadays well known as the first chatbot. So someone would type in this bolded text is what's entered by a person. A human would type in, "Men are all alike," and the computer would reply, "In what way?" Person, "They're always bugging us about something or other." Computer, "Can you think of a specific example?" Person, "Well, my boyfriend made me come here." Computer, "Your boyfriend made you come here." Person, "He says I'm depressed much of the time." Computer, "I am sorry to hear you are depressed." This system is a parody of psychoanalysis, specifically of Rogerian psychotherapy. And Doctor was only one of several ELIZA scripts, but it's the only one that Weizenbaum published about. There's others that there's archival evidence and information about. This system also eventually, because of the way that people responded to it, because of their interactions, because some people took it as a genuine psychotherapeutic intervention to be able to interact with the system, Weizenbaum ended up actually leaving MIT and repudiating AI, writing a book a decade later in 1976, Computer Power and Human Reason. But the reason I bring it up in the narrative context is that Janet Murray has described this aptly, I think, as the first computer character. So we can think of this as the first time we actually have a representation of character. Now, this this character isn't embedded in a story world, but character being one of the elements of narrative, it's intriguing to look at this as part of the formation of that aspect of narrative. In 1967 in New York, Alison Knowles, poet and Fluxus artist, working with James Tenney, developed a computer poem called The House of Dust, and it generated stanzas like this: a house of sand in southern France, using electricity, inhabited by vegetarians. Now, as you saw this massive number of stanzas describing a global and inclusive concept of all of these dwelling places around the world, you would also be able to notice some very, very specific aspects, like in some cases, specific countries or even states of the United States or regions of a country are named. People with idiosyncrasies, like the particular colors of clothing that they're wearing, are named. In other cases, there are things that are very general, and you have to imagine what a house of plastic might be, or what a house of wood maybe isn't very descriptive. There's very wide variations. There's many options for some of the lines. Others, there's very few. And this is a great example, I think, of a work that exhibits randomness, in that each of the lines is selected at random, but also regularity, because there's a form, a stanza shape, in which these 4 lines staggered inwards are produced endlessly. Now, if there were a story here, this would establish a strange story world, and I'd say at least it makes for a setting that is worth looking at. So again, another aspect of narrative. Now, in 1969, I'll bring us back to Manchester and read from Eric Mendoza's Little Gray Rabbit Stories. The sun shone over the woods. Across the fields softly drifted the breeze, while then the clouds, which calmly floated all the afternoon, moved across the fields. Now, in case you're waiting for something exciting to happen, no, that's pretty much it. As you can see here, it's all very atmospheric text. We would ask, actually, even if these entities are anthropomorphic, if they're not, by some definitions, we wouldn't have a narrative. It's just a description of things going on in the natural world. There doesn't seem to be any consequence. It's a sort of Edenic space in which anything could happen, other things could happen, things can happen again, but nothing changes. So we can say possibly we could advance arguments that these are narratives, but I want to appeal to Livia Pagliani's book, Telling the American Story, in which she describes a distinction between stories and narrative. And she says that stories are narratives that have a point, specifically a point within culture, so that there are some stories that make sense within a particular cultural framework that wouldn't be understood in other cases. And I mean, for instance, people encountering indigenous stories for the first time would often be perplexed at even why this is called a story, why it doesn't have the same type of structure that we might anticipate. In the case of these Little Gray Rabbit stories, I think they're misnamed because they might be Little Gray Rabbit narratives, but probably not stories. They probably don't have a point. And so I think it's valuable, though, to see how these develop. And the generator that Grimes created in 1963 probably did create stories with a point, as minimal as it was. All right. So I want to read you some things that I find rather exciting that are from the late 1980s. They're from the US, and they're actually not very well known. They are probably poetry generation systems, but they generate narrative types of poetry, and they were documented in these popular publications, the Los Angeles Times and Scientific American. And so I want to read two poems from this system by Rosemary West, which doesn't really have a name. It's just called Poetry Generator. As you keep spilling things on yourself, we discuss the possibility of revolution. No one is affected by celestial music, and someone asks that I've learned to love myself. And here's the second one. The disco dancers who never eat pork still expect to be paid. They don't care about your opinion. And without hesitation, you think about giving up. And the real story is that your secret has been sold. So this is done, by someone not associated with academic research, not associated with industrial text generation, a poet who was using her own poetic, I won't call it a corpus because this isn't a machine learning or corpus-based project, but her own poetic writings as part of this system. And you could read about it, for instance, in Fact Sheet 5, which was an index to zines and alternative publications. Mel is another intriguing system by another woman, Bonnie Ferner, and it produced text like this. A poet bird, I wait, smells a computer, muafumbo. What is the bird, coaxes muafumbo. You are too muddled, sings I wait. Shut up, sticks the computer, muafumbo. You should awaken, sings I wait. A blotchy computer contracts, it flops, the computer cavorts. I wait pinpoints the humble computer. The computer bloats, the decrepit bird churns the computer. She twists it. The computer plays. Why does the bird twirl, pleads the tree, Teweshi. I don't know, hoots Teweshi. Why does the bird think, coaxes the computer, Muafumbo. I don't know, hoots Teweshi. A computer contracts. Teweshi scents the computer. The computer cavorts. Teweshi pulls the computer. The computer decays in the year 225. So I want to mention now some about perhaps more conventional storytelling systems, systems that are created for research purposes. There have been many people, and there has been a thread of work on understanding narrative from cognitive standpoints, trying to understand the way that people are creative with narrative using computer systems. And one of the early systems, Tailspin, had a lot of influence, but I'm going to focus on the 1990s because I've been through the 70s and 80s and talked a little bit about nonfiction narrative generation. And these systems are representative of some different approaches. So the first one is quite intriguing. Daydreamer is a system, and I say is, it's 10,000 lines of common Lisp that are still available for you on GitHub if you want to download them and run them, that is based on a detailed cognitive model of how people daydream, how people associate and respond to events that have happened to them. Using Roger Schenk's conceptual dependency theory, planning, other methods, it generates texts in response to scenarios that are input. So in this case, the daydreamer is a woman who has, by chance, met Harrison Ford at a theater at a cinema in Los Angeles, and she asks him out on a date, and he declines. So these are the daydreams that she has in response, according to the system, that are generated by the system. And so one of them is a revenge fantasy. I study to be an actor. I am a movie star, even more famous than he, Harrison Ford, is. I feel pleased. He's interested in me. He breaks up with his girlfriend. He wants to be going out with me. He calls me up. I turn him down. I get even with him. I feel pleased. Right. And then there's other types of scenarios. There's association, there's rationalization. The association actually is just sort of just thinking about something different. It doesn't even perhaps always look very directly responsive to the particular event. But it's sort of something that might take your mind off something that troubled you that happened. Taylor is a classic small-scale system that is based on planning. And you can see this, it has these anthropomorphic animals with names. Once upon a time, there was an Arctic tern named Truman. Truman was homeless. Truman needed a nest. He flew to the shore. And so this is how planning systems work. In narrative, you create characters and you give them problems. And as they try to solve these problems, hilarity ensues, or there's some interesting narrative developments that happen, particularly when you have more than one character and they have some traits or goals that might be at cross purposes. So in this case, there's a player named Horace who chats with Truman, but ends up hiding the twigs so that rather than Truman being successful at his quest for home, Horace is able to eat him. So planning is one approach that is a classic approach in story generation systems, and another is story grammars. A story grammar is the type of approach that Joseph Grimes used. There was no planning that was involved back in 1963. He simply used the way that you would generate an individual sentence according to the grammar of a sentence. You could generate a sentence at random this way. This is something Victor Ingve did back in 1961 at MIT. So you can extend that to generate a narrative, thinking about the parts of this. Grandmother is an interesting system because what Caseborn did in developing this in the early 90s was to join both the planning approach and the story grammar approach. So it's a hybrid system that uses both of these. And this is a little bit of how this story begins. And in fact, this text that I'm showing you isn't the entire narrative that it's generated. Once upon a time, there was a queen called Emma who lived in a city called Atlantis. She had lived there happily for many years, but then one day a villager called Rebecca came to her city and killed her husband. So you can see the same type of situation like Truman looking for the nest, where a character has something that has disrupted her in this case and requires that some actions be undertaken, and that then the representation of these actions can be developed into a narrative. However, part of the search for Rebecca, the quest for revenge here, is actually depicted via a story grammar rather than being plotted out by a planner. So what I want to do in closing this part of my talk is read from a recent computer-generated novel, which is one of my own. This is something that I did originally for an activity that happens every November, now in its 10th year, or last month was in its 10th year, called National Novel Generation Month. And National Novel Generation Month, or NaNoGenMo, is, first of all, it's not national, it's actually an international activity. And secondly, it's not really about creating novels. Very, very few of the things that are generated in this activity are novels. There are books of 50,000 words or more. But it's based on this activity called NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, where people are supposed to disgorge a 50,000 word novel in a single month, whether or not they ever revise it, much less publish it. So Darius Kazemi, 10 years ago, came up with the idea that it would be a lot easier, instead of struggling through the writing of those 50,000 words, if you just wrote a computer program to generate those 50,000 words. And so people have been doing that since 2013. And they've been doing more frivolous and more serious types of things. And so in 2017, I developed a novel which draws on the English and simple English Wikipedias and tries to deal in a fragmented way with gun violence in the United States. It does not use any machine learning techniques, much less deep learning techniques, much less LLMs, which hadn't been developed at that point. And so this is called Hard West Turn. And I'll just read one screenful of this. The book has 3 parts. And so the ellipsis indicates that I'm skipping to a different part of the book. Certain things resonated in the otherwise still mind of the man. After being wounded, he killed himself by shooting himself in the head. Over 30 people were wounded, some from gunshots, others from falls or other injuries incurred during the incident, and many suffered psychological trauma or shock. Increasingly lived in an alternate universe in which ruminations about mass shootings were his central preoccupation. The man knew what he knew. If it is spoken out loud, predators often hunt by stalking. When a social network has already excluded or exiled one person. Without outward sign of it, the man sometimes had a swirl of thought. Then, it has influenced wars. According to the statement, psychology is the study of the way we think. It's not a game, is a peninsula. The couple had amassed a large stockpile of weapons. Problems with sleeping. The man had many thoughts, few of them clear. After his divorce. Some methods, like crucifixion and flaying, are no longer used by governments. All right. On that happy note, I will be glad to take questions. I'll be glad to return to any of the selections that I discussed to talk about them further. So I welcome your discussion.
Thank you for this travel into the history. It's a long history of what you call the storytelling of facts in comparison to the ChatGPT fake news, real news. We were eager to read your anthology. It's going to be published next year.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. In less than a year, in August. Yeah.
In August. Have you curated also the source code of the generators?
No, the anthology is simply a selection of existing output that has been published. So we chose, first of all, we have 175, about 175 selections. So we could not write computer programs to re-implement historically 175 generators. Also, for some, like Joseph Grimes' system, there's not enough evidence of how it worked. The source code does not exist. I have not been to the archives of IBM
so you don't
or UNAM, but some people have. And so the only thing we have is one paragraph. We have one paragraph of text. So
you
yeah.
don't go into the details, the way the generator were made.
Every one of our excerpts has a short introduction.
Okay.
We've tried to make it an anthology and not an academic book with quotations in it,
Okay.
right? So we've tried to produce a book that is for readers to understand computer-generated narrative and other types of computer-generated text through a direct encounter with it. So we do have a short introductions, and we have a bibliography, but usually with 1 or 2 entries for each of the selections. But we have about 175 selections, and we want people to experience it like they would, for instance, a poetry anthology. So instead of having a lot of apparatus, we want them to be able to, the same way a poetry reader encounters the poem, we want them to be able to encounter the output, the generated text. And then those who are intrigued by particular outputs, they can pursue the references and see where they came from, academic articles that discuss them, and so forth.
So you are guaranteeing that there is no word from human in your book, not any word from any human.
That's right. Yes, yes. I mean, there's all of the work in our book is the output of a computer program. Now, all of those computer programs have been written by people, of course, but we chose not to include even human-computer collaboration. So the so-called cyborg authorship, which you see in many works nowadays, right? So, for instance, my colleague Mark C. Marino has a recent book called Hallucinate This, an unauthorized autobotography of ChatGPT. And he wrote the book with ChatGPT. And in this case, he gave the prompt, and he describes the distinction between the prompt and the output. But there's other works like K. Alato McDowell's Amor Cringe, which are computer assisted. And it's not evident from looking at the book. It might be interesting as an experiment, but it's not evident what a person wrote and what a computer wrote. But so for our purposes, because the title of our anthology is Output, we're keeping it to output.
But the reason I asked this question, I publish computer generated output of GPT 3.5.
Yes.
It was before the public version of GPT.
Yes.
And one of the reviewers asked me, how do you prove it was written by ChatGPT and not by you?
Yes. Yes.
I could not prove anything. I haven't made any screen captures.
Yes. That's a very curious. It's like being accused of reverse plagiarism. Absolutely. Right? Like, wait, did your computer really write your paper, or did you write it? Yeah. So,
sure, there are actually computer-generated narratives.
Well, what we are doing is we are presenting what the system developers published, right? And these are, in some cases, it's peer-reviewed research. In some cases, they're literary publications, right? And to the best of our assessment, these are the outputs of computer programs specifically. And we've selected not things that are human-written and not things that combine human and computer writing, but just the computer output. So, and part of our doing this also is, of course, the authors of the systems, the developers of the systems, the author programmers, of course, have just like any author or publisher, they have their own agendas about how they want their work to be received, how to control the reception of their work, right? So the selection of what, like, for instance, the Ovid's Unicorn example is produced by OpenAI and published on February 14th, 2019 in their blog for a particular reason. It's to create, you know, a response to provoke the publicity that they got, right? And of course, part of the paratextual regime of that is to say this is too dangerous to release, but also the specific selection that, you know, we will choose, for instance, something that's obviously outrageous and false, that, you know, there's English-speaking unicorns discovered in South America, and then we'll have the system complete that, right? We could have had two sentences about the economy, and then, you know, have the, you know, two sentences about global trade agreements, and then have the system complete that. It would be very different. So we've decided to do what the system builders themselves, right? Instead of, we're always going to impose someone's view, whether it be an editorial view or the system creator's view. So we acknowledge that, but, you know, we're using Joseph Weizenbaum's transcript of ELIZA interaction. We're using OpenAI's press release. We do include, our book goes up to 2023. So we include the output of large language models.
But you don't include any non-English text, because, you know, in France we had...
That's right, yeah.
We had Oulipo, a section of the Oulipo.
So we have work by Paul Breffort, yes, for instance. We do have some work that was already translated.
Okay.
Right. So Marcel Benambo and Paul Breffort. Yeah, we have Des Ans and Triolet that they created and that are translated into English. But we did not commission any translations. And in both of these cases, for this anthology, because we wanted to have a project that spanned 70 years. That was and also that went across very, very many genres, right? So it's a huge amount of work to try to do this. I mean, our book includes generated letters, not just the love letters, but smoking cessation letters. There's systems for politicians to automatically generate letters that they send to their constituents. There's the generation of words, sentences, prose, storytelling, performance scripts, novels, poetry of all different sorts, formal and free verse, so sonnets, haiku. There's reporting, there's rhetoric. So there's a huge variety of this work. And we decided that, for many reasons, having to do with the amount of work, having to do with our own editorial competence, having to do with our English language publication. I mean, this is published by MIT Press and Counterpath, two US publishers. So for all of these reasons, we decided, let's focus on Anglophone literature and the small number of selections that we have. Nanni Bellastrini in Italian, Theo Lutz in German, these Oulipo, Alamo folks, you know, and a small number of others. Only that work that's been previously translated and that we think is particularly suitable in this context. Yeah.
Antonio?
Yes, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I have two questions. One
Tu,
is,
tu peux ouvrir ton micro, comme ça on t'entendra, ouais.
Yeah, sorry. I
was
was
saying
saying
thank you
thank
so
you so
much
much
for
for
this
this
very
very interesting talk.
One
I have two
has
questions. One actually has to do
Eliza,
with
it was
more of
based
a
on a
historical
model of
fact. When you
Rogerian
talked about
psychoanalysis.
Eliza,
And I
you
wanted
said
to
it was
know more
based
about
on
Rogerian.
Sure.
a model of
And the other
Rogerian
question is,
psychoanalysis.
you
I
notice, and
wanted
it
to know a
must
bit
happen
more
in
about
every
the
single presentation you
Rogerian.
made, that on
And
many
the other
instances we
presentation
laughed
made
about
on
this
outputs.
and so I wanted to know if you worked on the comic dimension that these texts
Okay.
and I
Yes.
noticed it every single time in which I showed, in some cases, audiovisual works that had a generated text. That
Yes.
invariably the comic side was in the textual output and not in the image may have all the artifacts, all the images that one wants, but it's hardly comic. Texts instead always produce this effect. So it's
something that really kind
Sure.
of really interesting.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yes, so the Eliza, it's actually a very complex project that Weizenbaum developed because he wrote a programming language. He used Michigan algorithm decoder, and then he wrote a programming language, SLIP, that ran on this programming language. And then he developed his framework system, Eliza, which is named after a character in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion and also in My Fair Lady, as a system that you could teach to speak in different ways, right? And so the doctor script is the psychotherapist script specifically. And that you have to, so one thing to understand is it's not intended seriously by Weizenbaum. It's a test of whether a computer can produce plausible exchanges of natural language. He did not intend it to have any psychotherapeutic value. Some people suggested that it could. So Sherry Turkle, who now has a very different perspective on computing, said, why not? If people write in their diary and it helps them, why not write to a computer and have it, something there? But the Rogerian psychotherapeutic approach, as I understand it, is, I know it mostly from Eliza Doctor. I don't really know it from, or perhaps there's other things culturally, there's other sort of popular cultural ideas about it. But, apparently it's just a very, not just very, but almost entirely reflective approach in which the therapist does not offer anything and just, my boyfriend made me come here. Your boyfriend made you come here. Right. And so that I think is something that Weizenbaum identified as, well, this is a very easy dialogue to carry on because I don't have to have any domain knowledge in order to be able to respond in this way.
Marie Lechner sent a reference on a paper on the way Weizenbaum turned against AI.
Yes. Yeah. So regarding the comedic effect, right? I think some of it, I think that even though it wasn't called out in Weizenbaum's 1966 ACM paper, he was attempting to be comedic. I think that was the point, because he was actually producing something that was more of a parody and not a simulation, certainly not a genuine psychotherapeutic intervention. And there's huge amounts more to say about this. He knew Kenneth Colby, who later produced a computer system called Perry, which is a simulated paranoid schizophrenic. And Kenneth Colby, before he was working with computing, he was developing formal models of what he thought paranoid schizophrenia was. But they knew each other, and so one idea is, well, Weizenbaum's system was maybe he was actually making fun of Kenneth Colby, even though that system doesn't occur until later. The computer system that he developed doesn't occur later, but his formal ideas occurred earlier. So I think in some cases, the comedy is there in the original text. In other cases, the juxtaposition of these texts, the combinatorial nature, produces amusement. But not always. I noticed people weren't laughing when I read the selection from Hard West Turn. And those are, except for the first sentence in each paragraph, which I wrote, those are just text from Wikipedia articles about mass shootings in the United States. Sometimes entire sentences, sometimes phrases. They're chopped up and placed in random configurations in a very simple way, actually.
In that case was the repetition.
Yes, yeah.
Olivier, tu as une question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's maybe not a question, but a remark.
Mhm.
You spoke about the Pauline's
Mhm.
Ovid book.
Yes.
It made me think of exercise de style.
Yes, 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 Juana.
Or
Yep.
the random sentences
Yes.
of Theolus.
Yes,
Make me think of
yes,
the cutoff techniques of William Burroughs.
yes,
And again,
Yep.
the last example, the poetry generator by Rosemary West
yes.
made me think of the Dada poetry
Mhm.
or even Allen Ginsberg poetry.
Yeah.
So besides the question of human presence,
Yeah.
what is the difference between the computer generating text and the human text?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that you're correct to make a connection to avant-gardes and their literary productions
Mhm.
and methods, right, in the 20th century. And there are some people who are aware of those connections. There are some people who are even participants in avant-garde movements. The use of the computer is there's all sorts of ways in which people might wish to amplify or transform certain ideas from those movements. So I have let me mention first of all that there's a range of engagement, and so on the one hand there's sort of the accidental or incidental avant-garde literary production. It's like it's like Moliere's character who's been speaking in prose all his life. It's like, oh, I've been a Dada artist all my life and I didn't realize it. And the people who create these computer systems, and if you take the perspective of the computer system, so for instance, Alison Knowles is connected with the activities of Fluxus, and the House of Dust comes out of that. But in other cases, if you think about the House of Dust as an automated Fluxus artist, you would have to say that some of these other computer systems are automated outsider artists, right? They actually don't have any training or intentional connection to the world. Perhaps they have, I don't know how you, they call them naive writers in Poland. I don't know how you say, or visionary artists. Right, people who are not who are neurally atypical, people who have different, radically different perspectives, and so maybe that's a way of thinking about computing. But there's a lot of different engagements with concepts of the avant-garde. Now, I can tell you that when it comes to large language models, right, and I'm thinking about pure large language models like ChatGPT, not like ChatGPT at all, like GPT-2, GPT-NeoX, Falcon 40B, OpenLlama. These are the models that you type something in and they complete what you've typed based on training data. They do not have any systems to prevent offensive or unpleasant or incorrect, factually incorrect language from being generated. Okay, so ChatGPT is another sort of system, but I'm talking about what I'll call pure large language models. Now, what I find intriguing about these, I'll tell you from a literary perspective, is that they continue the surrealist project on the scale of the internet. If we think about the surrealists as being interested in surfacing the unconscious, right, in their automatic writing and their games, and trying to say things that write things that they would not if they were conscious of it, right? When you work with a large language model, you type something in. You type in, what do you think about Black people, for instance? You're going to get exactly what people on the internet have continued that question with. And it's going to be very offensive, just as the surrealists, came up with things that were racist and other things also, right? But it will be the collective unconscious of not everyone in the world, because only some people get to write things online and contribute. There's a selective amount of text, but it will be surfacing the unconscious of everyone who's contributed to that pool of text that's been trained upon.
So if I understand you well,
yeah,
the machine is a kind of collective unconscious.
Well, so there's many machines.
Yeah.
There's many machines, right? So like Hovi's Pauline has nothing to do with this, right? So I think you have identified that the sibling of Hovi's machine, or the aunt or uncle, is exercise en style, right? That is the type of work that you'd have the same underlying situation, but you're able to present it and narrate it in different ways. That's exactly the connection there. But specifically the large language model, that one particular type of computing system, I connect personally to the Surrealist project, more than Dada, more than pataphysics, more than the Oulipo, more than conceptual writing, more than futurism, So,
Gabriela, do you have a question?
When you were talking about just grand stories,
yes.
You said something like his texts were written in a Vladimir Propp's ideas of literature.
Yes.
Something. And it makes me think and wondering if not all the systems were actually some sort of formal cyborgs, because they are more formal oriented than content oriented.
Yes. That's right. In fact, one of the things you note, and this is pointed out in the article, is there are no lions in Mexico or in Central or South America. I mean, there's mountain lions, I guess, but there's no lions here, in the way we imagine the African, the anthropomorphic king of the jungle. Achilles is a lion, that type of lion, right? So in fact, Grimes used puma instead when he was talking with his interlocutors. Yes, in many cases the form is definitely very prominent, but in others, like I don't know what the underlying algorithm is that animates Rosemary West's generator, but if you substituted George Trekkel or I'm trying to think of if you substitute I'm just trying to think of who would be the most, now I'm getting stuck. I'm trying to think of who would be the most hilarious poet to substitute, but someone, you know, I mean, Longfellow or something like this in American letters, someone who's very, you know, who's a very traditional poet, right? The way the text to be produced is entirely different. So I would say that some of these systems many of these systems, because of how they're developed, form is at their core. But sometimes you can do essentially the same thing and just substitute in different language, and you can get something that's very, very different. And so it can't be the form that by itself that is, you know, really essential. Yes.
Yeah. I have a few questions actually, but one is about specifically about Pauline.
Yes.
And do we know anything about the underlying data structures that allow the generation of it? Because specifically because also compared to the other one, it's
Hovey's thesis. It's well documented, and you can also ask him. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the sense of the one with the Office of Naval Research, you could tell that
yes,
some sort of like SQL based
yes,
columns and
that's right. That's right. That's another one that's not very funny.
No.
Right.
But I wonder how what kind of data structure allowed for like the generation of diversity and like granularity, and I had never seen this before. It was really interesting.
Yeah. So this is I mean, I think the thing about Pauline, and there's a few other systems like Rhetorica, which we've placed in a category called rhetoric, right? Which is actually quite some of our categories have, like the storytelling categories is all about almost entirely academic researchers investigating narrative from cognitive and, you know, creativity perspectives. And so everyone in that section, almost everyone knows about each other's work, and they've cited each other, and that's very cohesive. And then there's you know, this type of work as this micro genre of work, which we have called rhetoric. And so there are some academic systems like Pauline and Rhetorica. But we also, for instance, there was a speech delivered by a US representative on the floor of Congress that was generated by ChatGPT, right? So we've included that in this section. John Cage has a computer-generated text anarchy, which we have a very small selection from that. And so there's a lot of diverse approaches to this, some of which, you know, don't use, there's also a Polish, and originally, this is our one translation from Polish. We have a speech generator it's a basic program. You know, it was printed in a magazine. So people would type it in and it would produce these comedic speeches that were, you know, just about, you know, the good of the state and furthering things. And it was, so this, like Rhetorica, does have underlying representation of what the incident is that is to be narrated, and then it also represents the attitude of the speaker and the audience as well that it's directed toward. So I don't really have, it would be difficult for me to try to explain in more detail what the representations are, but Hovey has an entire dissertation about this, and it's remarkable for modeling not just the narrative content, but also the perspective of the speaker and the listener as well.
What is the most challenging thing working on it?
Oh, you mean on the anthology itself, or just on these? Well, so my own, I've done, I have a project called CurveShip, which is a narrative generator. And then I also collaborated on a system called Slant that is an integration between 3 different systems. And so these are my larger scale systems. When I write these, so annually I participate in NaNoGenMo. And that's not hard. I'm just writing a creative computer program. I'm writing a poetic and artistic computer program. And I do that all the time. I did it today. So it's, you know, it's just like the same things are hard if you just ask a traditional poet, like what's hard about writing a poem, or ask a painter, like what's hard about painting a painting. That can be hard, but it's not like it's a surprise, right? It's just, but these larger scale systems, I think, you know, one of the issues is that systems like Pauline, but also like the story systems from the 1990s, like Daydreamer and Taylor and Grandmother. So they are projects that they're generally done by one person for their dissertation. And then the way that the systems work, their outputs are documented, and the findings from the research is documented. And then, you know, we have that in the scholarly record. The challenge, though, is that, you know, no one else can use Grandmother. And there's one paper of 5 pages long about Taylor. So, you know, no one can use Taylor, right? As I said, Daydreamer, the code for it is online, but I don't know who's interested. Is anyone wanting to take a look at 10,000 lines of Common Lisp? Yeah, Pierre's going to dig in, so you'll have some free time, right? You know, there's a note that Eric Mueller put up on the GitHub repository. He says, well, I want to make this available so people can expand it. They're like, no, don't expand it. You need to make it smaller, you know? So the project that I'm doing with the Center for Digital Narrative, and right now with some undergrads, is a project to create miniatures of various narrative generating systems to do just the essential elements of what they do. It's called narrative nubs, as in the nub of the argument. And so we're going to make very small scale programs. We have done this in one or two cases already, but we're going to create small systems in Python. And when they need to share a library, like a planner, or for instance, the conceptual dependency model that Roger Schenk developed, which is used both in Daydreamer, but also in Tailspin, we'll just create one implementation of the library. And the hope is then that we do it well enough. We don't, the miniatures that we create won't exactly produce the same outputs, but they will capture the essence of these earlier systems. They'll do the important things that the systems do, and they can be compared side by side. And when they share certain machinery, we put it in a library, and that makes everything easier to deal with. So they can be used, hopefully, not just by us, but by others for teaching and research.
But don't you think that the deep learning generative AI are going to kill the development of rule-based generative text software? Or?
No,
No.
I think that's about as likely as unicorns having four horns, I would say. No, specifically, but let me respond, because in this year, in 2023, the BBC, okay, in the UK, has for the first time generated election coverage. They've generated articles, computer-generated articles for all the regional elections, okay? And it's a company that Ehud Ryder founded, and they generated almost all of them in English, but some in Welsh also. So this was done this year in 2023 with no machine learning or large language models, obviously, being used for many reasons. First of all, they needed to assure that it was right. So these models are all probabilistic, right? So they're all there. If you run them several times, they're going to produce different results, right? And so so if you want to provoke yourself, if you want to tap into the collective unconscious, if you're a surrealist, you know, these are great for you. But the BBC is not a surrealist, right? And in fact, there's a very limited number of people in the world who are at this stage, right? So the BBC, first of all, needs to make sure that the articles are correct. They need to make sure they're factually correct. They need to make sure they're in BBC style, which can't be generated consistently. And they also, even if you said, okay, well, we'll step back, we'll use a machine learning system, we're not going to do this whole, you know, BARD or ChatGPT thing, but they don't have any training data because they've never covered regional elections before. This is the first time that regional elections will be covered. So they don't have a corpus to train on, right? So you have a major project that's done using a traditional three-stage natural language generation system in 2023, and that's one of many. So I see that there's very, very narrow cases in which, for poetic and artistic purposes, these systems can be intriguing. But even in literary use, that's only one direction.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Glad to see you here in Paris.
Yes.
I have a question about your anthropology,
Yes.
and more especially about the selection criteria.
Mhm.
Because how do you select the text
Yeah.
you include in the anthology? What are your artistic and aesthetic criteria?
Sure.
And is it based, are the criteria based on the model, on the code,
Yes.
on the output, and what is really important for you?
Okay.
For example, is it the correspondence of the output to socially acceptable text, or is it weirdness? For
Okay.
example?
Sure. Well, sure. So first of all, it's not only artistic and creative work that's in the anthology. We include generated news. We include reports. We include sentences that were generated as part of early machine learning research, for instance. So all of these are machine translation research. There is a lot of literary creative work, not only the genres I mentioned, but Twitter bots, which don't exist anymore. They're not running anymore. You mentioned text versus image. We have actually a text image section, a visual poetry section also. So there's a lot of different genres. The main criteria is that, so first of all, the output has to be interesting to read in some way. Sometimes it's extraordinarily repetitive, but we wanted to be able to cover different approaches to text generation. So, I mean, we have a selection from a short story, a very, very long short story that exhaustively goes through and produces sentences like, the pigs pigged the pigs, the pigs pigged over the pigs, the pigs pigged with the pigs. and it goes through, the pigs pigged over the umbrellas, and it's just a very, very tedious, lengthy exercise in this. We've included an excerpt of this as, one example of the type of work that people have done and published. But that's one extreme. We don't have a whole chunk of the book that's like that, right? So is it representative of something important? Is it an important system or work itself? In some cases, we need to choose how much or what, if the one do we select? Well, perhaps not the one that's already online or that's been presented a lot before. We want to, introduce something new. What will be good for our readers? We've made selections from novels. And so, what's the right length that people are going to be interested to read this and see some of the idea behind it? And what a computer-generated novel is, you have to have a rather liberal idea of what a computer-generated novel is. It's often something that is novel length and has some connection to the novel tradition, right? It's based on some idea about the novel. So, but it's not something that you would think about in the category in normal terms. So I hope that explains some of it. I mean, some of it is a traditional selection process, and in some ways we want to make sure that our selections are also good windows into the history of computer-generated text.
Olivier?
Yes, I'm curious. On the same topic, have you tried both writing with the computer and without the computer, as a human being alone?
Yes.
And if yes, what is the difference?
Okay. So yes, I have some so I mean it's a very broad question because when I when my dean sends me an email and I have to respond, I don't use the computer to respond. I write myself, right? That's so the genres of writing that all of us undertake, right, are very broad. So my own poetic work is often engaged with constraint and form. What's that?
The poems on your website.
Yes. So, well, I have both poems that I wrote and poems where I programmed the underlying generator, right? But my main practice is in writing programs that generate text. So, but ultimately, I mean, for myself, what I can say is I am an explorer of language, whether I work as a poet programmer or as a poet. And so I'm not interested in personal expression or the engagement with my emotions or psychotherapeutic outcomes like Eliza Doctor would provoke. I really want to discover more about language in many ways, like a linguist, except I don't take a scientific approach or a social scientific approach. I don't know I don't take a linguistic approach. Instead, I make poems and I make computer programs in order to do my exploration of language. And so I'm motivated the same way, whether I am writing myself or whether I'm working with a computer. But when I work with a computer, I'm also able to explore something else that interests me a great deal besides language, which is computation. So that allows me to see how computation and language interact. And you were asking earlier about the avant-gardes, and one thing I'll say is there is a point that even though if you look at, so a video game like Fortnite or Call of Duty, right? Or Quake, one of these first-person shooter games, Half-Life, all of these games, right? When you look at these games, what's underlying them is perspective drawing, right? It was invented in the Renaissance. Like that's the same thing is being done, right? There's actually nothing new that the computer's doing. It's just automating the process of perspective drawing, right? So what happens is when it goes at 60 frames per second automatically, and it's able to produce a simulated, virtual environment by doing that, it becomes something qualitatively different, right? You could, if you every one of those frames, someone who's trained in perspective drawing could just do it themselves, right? You wouldn't need the computer to do it. But as you accelerate that process, something entirely different becomes possible and is realized. And so that's the work of engagement with language through computation, being a poet programmer instead of a poet. And that's the difference between the avant-gardes of the 20th century, with the exception of Alamo, for instance, but most of the avant-gardes of the 20th century that didn't engage with computing, and their transformation through the computation.
Je crois qu'il y a des questions online. There's a question of Hermès. Can you read it in French?
Let me see. I can't right now.
You can have
Oh, no, I see. Chat. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
There was several questions.
Yeah.
The first
Okay.
one was from Joanna Rogers about the tools used for each project.
Okay. Let me go back. Sorry, who's it from?
From Joanna
yes.
Rogers.
Okay, so I would, yes. So Joanna, good to see you, or read your text anyway. We have included a glossary at the end of the book that is, first of all, lists technical terms. So it will say, have things like Markov chain, large language model, but also actually it includes sonnet, haiku, because some people who are coming to the book from a technical perspective may not know about these, traditional forms in English. So when we, after we gloss these terms, we give the most, we give examples. We can't be exhaustive because in some cases we don't know what techniques or tools were employed. The information is just not provided to us. But we've done our best to have the glossary entries be another index into the book itself.
And there were
Yes.
some more questions.
Okay.
Yes. Question of Hermès.
Yes, the circulation of text.
Yes.
Yes, producing
Yes.
fictional text.
The complexity of making
Yes. 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 So there are many difficulties in general with digital literature, things that are not presented through the publishing industry in books. In terms of having this work translated and accessible to other language communities, right? So it's the Alliance Française is the organization that funds the translation of French works.
Not Alliance Française, but
It's
le Centre National du Livre.
okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, that even has it in its name. Has to be a book, right? So if you wanted to, if you want to have a French book translated to English, you have support from a cultural foundation, right? And of course, that's not every language is in that same situation, but there are foundations. There's Spanish language foundations. There's more for Iberian Spanish and less for Latin American Spanish for the translation of work. There's organizations like this, but none of that funding is really available for translating not only text generation projects, but even for other hypertext literature or other things like this. The only time you're going to get translated digital narrative is in video games, where you'll have different voice actors and subtitles. So video games with a narrative component, like those of David Cage, a French game maker who did I guess Detroit Human is his most recent, which is a very nice production, I think. I don't like all of his work as well, but that one is I think quite good. So that work gets localized because it's commercial, and so it's tough to do this. I had a project called Renderings, where we translated works from other languages into English. In fact, that's how Benabo and Brafort, their pieces got translated into English. It was part of my project. We translated that Polish speech generator. We translated work from Spanish, from Japanese, have a Chinese bilingual piece, and I think that was about it. And we were very broad in looking at work, at seeking computational work in various places, including computer magazines. Looking at basic programs and translating those. But just to give an example of how challenging working across languages is in this area. My collaborator, colleague, Rafael Perez y Perez from Mexico City. So his system, Mexica, which now for about 25 years, he's been developing, it's a story generation system. It's represented in the anthology. His system tells the stories of the pre-Hispanic inhabitants of Mexico, the people of the Valley of Mexico. They're sometimes called the Aztecs, but they call themselves the Mexica. And because he's in computer science, up until like 5 years ago, his system always generated in English because he needed to publish in computer science publications, and they're all in English. So the first time that his system's Spanish language output, I actually published it in my book series in the United States, in English and in Spanish. But it's very challenging to work across languages.
Thank you so much. If nobody has last question, Chair, maybe for last question.
Yes. It's come up in the discussion a few times, but not in what you put in the book. And what about the video games?
Oh yeah. So because of our focus on, so we do include text image work where there's a generated image, generated visual poetry, but things that are so highly interactive. And we also have performance scripts, right? But at some point, the super highly interactive multimedia nature of the work makes it very difficult to capture things. So we have included, I'm trying to think, we have some of the Dwarf Fortress sagas that will be in there. but that's a very bizarre example of a video game. So there's actually, you know, the use of text generation in video games is not extremely widespread. So it is there in Caves of Cud and in Dwarf Fortress, but you have to look at these rather unusual games, and they sort of sneak it in strange places, right? Video games and narrative are very compelling, I think, for other reasons, but they're just not the main event for text generation. We did find a story generator that from the early 1980s, the mid 1980s, was released for IBM, Atari, 8-bit computers, and Commodore 64. It's called Story Machine, and it's for kids. It's for like 4-year-olds. And it would create very, very fanciful stories. And in fact, it's the first thing that we re-implemented in the Narrative Nubs project. But it has like these animations, like with leitmotifs, like little music for each of the characters and objects, and so where our implementation doesn't capture any of that, it's just the text that it can generate.
Merci beaucoup, Nick. Thank you so much. Merci à toutes et à tous. Rendez-vous pour la prochaine séance, je ne me souviens plus, en mars. Voilà, on ne se revoit pas en mars. Et à très bientôt, le 5 mars. Bonne fin de journée à tous les participants. Au revoir et merci encore, Nick.
Merci beaucoup.